Hello, and welcome to the Tech Dirt Podcast. I'm Mike Masnick. Today's podcast is going to be a little bit different than usual. Rather than having me open with one of my usual monologues or rants or whatever you want to call it, we're going to hand the microphone over to our guest, Professor Gabriella Coleman from McGill University. Coleman has a new book, Hacker, Hoaxer, Whistleblower, Spy, which is an astoundingly great book delving into the world of Anonymous. Unlike the typical press portrayal of Anonymous, which tries to reduce the concept to simplistic phrases and ideas, Coleman has spent years studying Anonymous and various offshoots, and is clearly the world's foremost expert on what Anonymous is really about. She's going to now read a section from the book, though you should really read the whole thing yourself if you haven't already. And from there, we'll have a discussion about Anonymous, hacktivism, the book itself, and more with myself and Dennis Yang. So, Gabriella, go for it.
Great. Thanks for having me. So This is from the introduction. On July 29th, 2007, an entity calling itself Anonymous, unknown at the time to all except the most erudite internet denizens, uploaded a video to YouTube. A metallic digital tone thrums as a headless suited man appears over a blank background. A male voice begins to speak through the interference. Dear Fox News, it intones. The news organization had recently devoted a segment entirely to the group they described as the Internet Hate Machine, a title the collective would subsequently adopt as a badge of honor. But for a collective that revels in trickery and guile, to simply laugh and dismiss such an expose would be to miss a great opportunity. And so the disturbingly ponderous, down-pitched voice of Anonymous continues. The name and nature of Anonymous has been ravaged, as if it were a whore in a back alley, and then placed on display for the public eye to behold. Allow me to say quite simply, you've completely missed the point of who and what we are. We are everyone, and we are no one. We are the face of chaos and the harbingers of judgment. We laugh at the face of tragedy. We mock those in pain. We ruin the lives of others simply because we can. A man takes out his aggression on a cat. We laugh. Hundreds die in a plane crash. We laugh. We are the embodiment of humanity, with no remorse, no caring, no love, and no sense of morality. The video ends. You have now got our attention. They certainly got mine. Soon after the video's publication, I became entangled in a multi-year research project on a collective that I have only now just twisted my way out of. And this book monumentalizes that struggle. The video was meant to satirize Fox News' hyperbolic characterization of Anonymous as the ultimate purveyors of internet pranking and trolling. Hackers on steroids, as Fox had called them. And yet the creepy sentiments and chilling style captured the troll's terrifying side perfectly. Instead of overturning Fox News' ridiculously one-sided portrayal, the video seemingly confirmed it to the utmost, though only, of course, to those not in on the joke. And here I'm going to just give a bit of a transition for a second and go back to one paragraph. 6 months after being called the Internet Hate Machine, Anonymous engages in earnest activism for the first time, and soon after became a protest movement, a digitally based one with real consequences across the world. And now back to the introduction. And yet, even after Anonymous drifted away from ungovernable trolling pandemonium to engage in the global political sphere, whenever people scrutinize its activist interventions, whether in a street protest or a high-profile computer intrusion, a question always seemed to loom. Are Anonymous and its adherents principled dissidents, or are they simply kids screwing around on the internet as lulz drunk trolls?
And to get the answer to that, you need to read the rest of the book.
Exactly.
But let's discuss this. I mean, let's discuss a little bit of the background. I mean, you know, beyond just sort of seeing these things, what sort of drew you to this topic in the first place?
So I was drawn to the topic because I had a secret project, and it was on the Church of Scientology. Mm-hmm. As most geeks and hackers know, in the 1990s, when a number of critics of the church released secret church documents on the internet, specifically on Usenet, the church kind of went ballistic and started to sue people over trademark and copyright. There were big battles over anonymity. And I had a project on Scientology because I'd spent a year as a postdoc at the University of Alberta, where there were the largest Scientology archives in the world. And I was quite secretive about the project. I was concerned about Scientology. And so when this thing by the name of Anonymous appears, and they became quite famous when they had first trolled and pranked the Church of Scientology and then turned around and kind of earnestly protested them, that's when I turned my attention to them, never thinking that they would go from a kind of trolling outfit and a boutique protest movement against Church of Scientology to what they became.
Right. And, I mean, how quickly did you realize that shift was happening? I mean, it is kind of amazing, right? I mean, you look back at sort of, and even today, I mean, I think that's part of what confuses everyone about it. You look back at sort of the history or path that Anonymous has taken, and it's not what I think anyone expected, even probably people involved in it. Absolutely.
Trolling, which exceeds Anonymous. There's a lot of trolling on the internet, but it's really cynical.
Yeah.
It's, got a politics because it's about transgression, but it's not a politics that seems amendable to earnest activism, to activism about social justice.
Yeah.
And so it really seems inhospitable to the turn that Anonymous took. And I did not expect it. And in fact, when they had started to protest the Church of Scientology, as an anthropologist, I had an explanation, which was, Scientology is the evil doppelganger, evil nemesis, tailor-made enemy of the hacker world, because it's a religion of technology that does not work. And, fake science fiction that they treat as science. So I was like, oh, okay, under the right conditions, the geeks will, of course, attack Scientology, but never go beyond that. Mm-hmm. And then that's exactly what happened. And I do think in retrospect, there is an explanation. But at the time it was unfolding, it was just a surprise every step of the way.
Yeah, I mean, was there one specific thing that kind of marked a shift from kind of like a pranking, trolling group to something different? Like what was it?
So I think, the earnest protesters against Scientology just, made it kind of possible to think about Anonymous as an activist entity. Mm-hmm. And then you combine that with V for Vendetta as well, which is really, important in popular culture through both the graphic novel and the movie. But the two things that really secured it were when Anonymous supported WikiLeaks after the banking blockade, after all these companies acquiesced to, U.S. government asking them to pull the plug when WikiLeaks releases the diplomatic cables. And then all of a sudden, Anonymous set the stage for the largest distributed denial of service attack in the world. And I think it drew an enormous amount of tension. And there was a lot of validation that occurred through that operation. And then soon after, this was also the pivotal point, because up till then it was like internet issues, defend piracy, anti-Scientology, WikiLeaks. And then when they got involved in Tunisia, it was like, oh, this entity can get involved anywhere in the world. Had they not gotten involved in Tunisia, it might have just sort of been this very, very internet-focused form of activism that, just petered out even.
Yeah. So, and I mean, I remember certainly, when the story started coming out about the involvement in Tunisia, but just for our listeners who haven't, I mean, do you want to just give sort of a quick overview of like some of the stuff that they did? And the thing that struck me as interesting about it, as a kind of lead-in, was, you talked about sort of the difference between trolling and kind of earnest protest, but they brought the two of them together, right? I mean, the earnest protest was often done in a very trolling manner, even in situations that, there's very serious things happening in the Middle East, and yet they were still taking sort of the concepts of traditional internet trolling and then throwing it out in a very earnest manner. It struck me as a very both surprising and interesting way that they went about doing these things.
Absolutely. So trolling, was something that, first of all, occurred still under the name of Anonymous pretty vigorously between 2008 and 10, and then almost entirely waned, except that it was used tactically, very explicitly. And so trolling kind of showed its sharp dragon teeth, many times. And maybe we should talk about Operation Bart later, because that was the perfect example of it. But with something with Tunisia, some Tunisian geeks reached out to Anonymous on Internet Relay Chat, the kind of place where many Anons would hang out, and they decided to eventually get involved. And, on the one hand, they did very traditional activist-y things like shuttle out videos and, provide information about how to encrypt yourself, but they also were engaging in DDoSing, distributed denial of service attacks, overwhelming, servers with too many pings. They engaged in quite a bit of hacking as well.
Right.
And in some future operations, they really, really were quite vicious in their trolling.
Yeah. And it strikes me as interesting, just the way that those two things sort of come together, just because it's kind of funny just to see. I don't know if funny is the right word. I'm struggling for. Which is one of the things in sort of talking about Anonymous is there are sort of all these contradictions, but it also kind of makes sense, right? Sort of the deeper you go into it, at least in my experience, right? It's like I can understand, almost all of the things that happen, and yet some of them, like if you just took a step back, you'd be like, that doesn't make any sense, but it does.
Absolutely. I don't like to use the word random with Anonymous, but I like to use unpredictable.
Yeah.
Because you're not sure when they're going to strike.
Yeah.
And yet there's also some kind of core tactics that emerge time and again. And because trolling is so... Well, sometimes it's not morally ambivalent. It's just like, wow, that's wrong. But other times
Right.
it is morally ambivalent.
Yeah,
A lot
sure.
of people, when I present the Scientology troll, when Anonymous was first trolling them, like everyone laughs.
Right.
Everyone's like, that's so great that they sent pizzas to the churches and they called the Dianetics hotline,
Yeah.
And then in other moments when, there's collateral damage where, for example, when they hacked into BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit, and we can talk about why they did that. They released customer data. They had nothing to do with what went wrong, right?
Right.
People were, even Anonymous, were incredibly pissed.
Yeah. Well, and that, sort of, brings up the other point, which is, one of the reasons why I think, traditionally, certainly the press has a lot of trouble discussing Anonymous and understanding is that just the, just the fact that we're sort of referring to Anonymous as a thing is difficult, right? Because it's this sort of, amorphous, not quite group, not quite idea, not quite, concept. It's just its own thing, right? And so it's even difficult to discuss because even as we're talking, I'm always like, well, yeah, we're even the way we describe it isn't necessarily fair, right? To Anonymous, even you who spent all this time writing an entire book about it. It's like, how do you encapsulate all of that into what is Anonymous?
Absolutely. That's why I also I turn to the trickster mythology, and the trickster are figures in literature and myth like Puck from Shakespeare or Coyote from North American indigenous traditions. And one quality of many tricksters is that they shapeshift, they change form, and they're very hard to pin down. And I think Anonymous, both because they're very mythic and the art they produce, and then they're also very hard to pin down, really kind of aligns well with this trickster figure. And they have become like the internet's trickster, which oftentimes I think some people think the trickster is there only to be celebrated. And the trickster does, function in important ways in terms of reminding society that we have to have people who dare to break rules, but a lot of trickster myths also are used to show, well, if people go too far and rule breaking, like chaos and destruction ensues. It's not simply for celebration, but for sort of learning from what's going on with the trickster.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's interesting in that there are consequences, right? And it is interesting to see even how Anonymous itself has sort of dealt with those consequences, right? And so some of it is just in terms of things like, as you were saying before, where certain members of Anonymous would release data that others felt was inappropriate. And there have been other times too where, Anonymous will pick a target that other people think, they shouldn't pick. And so there, have these offshoots and discussions. And of course, some of the different offshoots, argued that it's because Anonymous was getting too political for this or too focused on this. And so it's this sort of interesting ongoing experiment where, right, I mean, with with regular experiments, you see things and you try this and that, and some things work and some things fail, right? And so you have that same sort of thing happening in a very sort of, it's prototype trolling, right?
That's excellent, because I think you're absolutely right. It is ongoing experimentation, and they learn and shift, but they're so open to trying new things. And because when you're open to trying new things, you have to be in an experimental mode. And I think that's right. Always prototyping. And it's this fusion of trolling and activism in a very experimental moment.
So let me bring up something else in terms of, if we're talking about the consequences of trolling, I mean, one of the big consequences certainly is that a number of members of Anonymous around the globe have been arrested, and some are in jail and some will be in jail for a very long time. How big of a shift do you think it was when members started to get tracked down and actually arrested for their activities?
So I think the depth and extent of the arrests were significant enough, especially if you also include folks like Julian Assange, who hasn't been arrested, but obviously he's kind of in soft form of house arrest, and Chelsea Manning, that there is something, that I call a nerd scare in the book, quoting from a National Guild's lawyer. And I think while the crackdown against hackers and geeks is not as severe as against environmentalists and Muslims in the United States, we are going down that path. And it is certainly the case that there was a kind of chilling effect and also a shifting of both types of operations that came into being in the English-speaking world. So after many of the arrests of 2011, 2012, you didn't have as many hacks occurring in the United States or Western Europe. Instead, you had cases like the ones revolving around publicizing rape cases in Steubenville, Ohio, and Halifax, Canada, a little less high risk. I mean, there are risky moments, but it's not, hacking defense contractors left and right? It's just like, whoa, like Cory Doctorow, I think, described it as like insane risk taking.
Right.
But there has been a shift where there's a lot of hacking going on in Latin America. So there's a group called LulzSec Peru, and they almost brought down the Peruvian government in September of 2014 when they hacked into the government. They found really damning emails about government corruption. There was a vote in the government, and they were one vote shy from dismantling. And they're still quite active. And, understandably, reporters, first of all, it's tough to access the hackers. And then if you have to do it in a foreign language, it's almost impossible. So a lot of that activity going on in Asia and Latin America is going on below the radar right now.
Which brings up another question, certainly, which is just, I mean, how, you ended up getting to know a lot of the different people who are involved in Anonymous, and I mean, how did you do that in the first place, and sort of how do you think that impacted the way you sort of viewed everything that they're doing, and in terms of how you presented them in the book?
When a lot of journalists read the book, I think that they're a little bit shocked and surprised at how close I got to individuals, both during my time online and then after people got arrested. I went to prison and I went to trials, and I, hung out with members of Anonymous. I wrote them letters of recommendation at certain points.
Right.
But for an anthropologist, this is par for the course. This is what we do. The closer you get, the better, at some level. Mm-hmm. And it is certainly the case that, most anthropologists pick topics that they're somewhat already sympathetic towards. Otherwise, you're going to have like a hellish time for those couple of years, like hating everyone you're studying, right? And there are certainly, trade-offs. So because they trust you so much, they give you information that they might not give to someone who is more impartial, right? And I think as I went along, I just made it very clear, that I was very sympathetic. But one of the things I was very mindful to do was include those ugly moments during the activism. Mm-hmm. And I include them because I feel like people have to make their own reach their own conclusion as to whether this is acceptable or not acceptable. So that's a little bit about the kind of anthropological relationship. One of the interesting things is that this book could not have been written in the form it was, except for those arrests. I got a lot of data during the course of my research, but I was very adamant that people should not be giving me criminal information, especially as it was occurring.
Yeah.
And I would have to remind people, and a couple times they kind of still told me things I wish they hadn't. They were pretty minor in the grand scheme of things.
Right.
But I was really nervous. I was really nervous of what would happen if, the government came knocking on my door and subpoenaed me. I was like, I would have to go to jail, and I was trying to avoid that.
Right.
And after the arrests and people went through the court systems, they were able to talk more freely. They offered up chat logs that were either part of the legal case, or they just leaked them to me and had anonymized them. So I was able to get, forms of data that would not have been possible had, all those hackers had they had better security, basically.
And so how concerned are you personally because, for better or for worse, and oftentimes I think for worse, especially among certain government officials, they still see Anonymous as a sort of, horrifying, horrible, online terrorists that need to be tracked and taken down and all these kinds of things. And so they're certainly investigating and have investigated, even, beyond the arrests. Are you nervous that people are tracking you as well?
So I was pretty sure that during my research, they were tracking me. Mm-hmm. And it was somewhat confirmed later when Hector Monsegur, also known as Sabu, who was a very charismatic hacker involved in Anonymous, LulzSec, an offshoot, and AntiSec, also an offshoot, was revealed to be an informant. So there was a big article in Fox News in March of 2012, and I had met with him about 6 times in New York City, and he had reached out to me. And I could only assume that he was under the FBI's watch at the time.
Right.
I think he had probably his own agenda as well, and he never would, answer me explicitly. I asked him once his name was revealed, and, our first meeting was, in a Chipotle, and he's like, Jesus Christ, you don't have to effing ask for permission to get a burrito. I was like, well, supposedly that you were under their watch 24 hours a day, so maybe you do have to ask permission to get a burrito with the anthropologist, And that was very disconcerting. And I think I got really sick soon after. I was really stressed about that. Yeah. And I knew, when I was meeting with him, I knew, always that's a possibility. And he was actually not fishing directly for information. Had he been, the red flags probably would have gone up too much, Mm-hmm. So who knows what was going on? And one thing is clear, too, is that, he is the only one we came to learn about, and that's very interesting why. Yeah. Because they don't like to give up their names of informants, or there are probably other ones as well.
Right. Interesting. And then, going to sort of a more recent case also, there's the whole situation with Barrett Brown, right, who recently got sentenced to jail.
I was going to say nailed, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a fair assertion on it. And, what was interesting there, and there's obviously a lot of different pieces that are interesting there, where, he was accused of being a part of Anonymous. He claimed he was just basically reporting on them and had connections to them. And then, a lot of the focus of his case was that some of the charges were based on his copying a link to the documents that had been hacked from Strat4, and those included some credit cards, and therefore he was accused, because he copied and pasted that link into basically a chat room, that was trafficking in stolen credit card information. And those charges, after people sort of freaked out about the idea that merely copying and pasting a link should be seen as trafficking in stolen cards, those charges were dropped. And yet, when he was actually sentenced, the judge still brought that up as part of the reason why he gave him such a long sentence. And I know that, certainly for folks on the reporting side of the table, it's made plenty of people really nervous that should be seen as a criminal thing. And I know that Quinn Norton, who is a reporter who also covers Anonymous, and assorted offshoots very closely, has basically said that she's kind of now afraid to report on it anymore. What was sort of your reaction to all of that? Did you feel sort of similar to Quinn, or how did you feel about everything that kind of came out with the sentencing of Brown?
Yeah, the sentencing was outrageous insofar as, you have the charge dropped, which was thanks to excellent kind of legal help, and because the charges were so bogus in the first place, and yet they sneaked their way back in, and in two ways, both for the kind of sentencing guidelines, but his fine as well. He got fined, hundreds of thousands of dollars. He didn't hack. He didn't ask them to hack. He wanted the kind of journalistic information. In fact, he had offered to redact the names to kind of protect the people's information, right? And so to me, it was just so disturbing, because in this case, the message being sent was, even if you're a journalist, if you are working in any way closely with hackers, we are going to get you. Yeah. And there is this burgeoning fifth estate of hackers and leakers and whistleblowers and bloggers who, don't have as much institutional protection as a reporter for the New York Times, who don't have as much protection as I, maybe tend to have with an institution. So they're very vulnerable. And I am currently not so concerned because I'm not in the thick of things. Mm-hmm. But had that happened in the middle of my research, I might have had to really recalibrate in certain ways that would have been problematic insofar as it would have chilled my research, right?
Yeah.
And again, it happened afterwards. The book is out. I'm not so concerned because, I might engage in this sort of research again, but I'm not doing it now. But had it happened during the time, it probably would have forced me to change what I was asking and doing, and that's a problem.
Yeah.
Because it was legitimate,
Yeah, yeah.
And some of the other charges, he should have gotten in trouble for, but, not this one.
Yeah, and that's why, the fact that it sort of came back up even after they dropped those charges is really concerning. It's
really concerning. And it's, at least they were explicit about it. I don't know. Maybe they had to be. Because it signals what we're up against in many ways. Once I thought it was gone, that charge.
Yeah, well, so did I. That's why I was actually really confused when I saw the reporting from the courtroom and people were talking about it. I was like, but they dropped that charge. Why is the judge even bringing it up?
I was so confused. I was like, wow, I'm not a lawyer or anything, but I follow this stuff closely, and this is confusing me.
Yeah, and just on that, in terms of sort of going back to the different people, being put in jail and all this kind of stuff. One interesting element to it also that struck me was the different ways that defendants in the U.S. were treated as opposed to some of the defendants overseas. And it seemed like the level of punishment that was given to people in the U.S. was much more serious than overseas. And do you have any thoughts on that, or sort of what was both what was your reaction to it, and also what do you think the reaction was among people who were involved with Anonymous?
The sentencing around Anonymous is a good vantage point to look at U.S. exceptionalism in the law when it comes to criminal punishments, whether it's hacking or everything else. The sentencing guidelines for about every crime really exceed what goes on in much of the sort of Western world. And it was quite another thing, though, going to actual trials as well. So I went to a trial in Ireland where two young men who had participated in Lulzsec Anonymous, they had defaced the Fine Gael political party website. And I went to the trial expecting, like a very, very serious trial that was simply about the case. And yes, like many of the other ones in UK, I thought they were going to get a lot less time, but nevertheless, it was going to have like a certain gravitas and seriousness. And I show up an hour late, first of all, because I've ditched my cell phone by then after Snowden. And I wasn't late because the two cases were rolled in with about another 24 very petty crimes.
Right.
I'm talking about like riffraff stealing, beer from the local shop or whatever.
Right.
And I just could not believe it. I mean, I was like, wow, this is in the middle of these things. And the judge, when they came up, the atmosphere did change a little bit because clearly they stuck out. But the judge really could tell what was going on. She was very unhappy with what they did. She did not think what they did was political, but she also was like, you didn't harm anyone. You defaced the website. I don't want to send you to jail. That's going to ruin your lives. This is not necessary. The Fine Gael defendants were like, it cost $10,000 to put back our website. And they're like, the judge is like, why? Don't you have like backups? Right. She was really smart. You know what I mean? And then next thing you know, no jail time, a minor fine, which half goes to charity, half goes to the political party. And being there just reminded me about how different it is in the United States. And I remember the British guys who really were on these huge hacking sprees. The most that a person got was 15 months in jail after he had a 30-month, but it was you do half that time and no fine. His life is not ruined.
Right.
And 15 months in jail is a big punishment still, right? And so I think the question is, are there going to be reform movements in the United States to try to change this? And importantly, is the U.S. trying to pressure probably these countries to move the other way? Yeah. So, but hack on the other side of the Atlantic, if you're going to do it.
Yeah. I mean, that the story about the Irish trial, which is in the book, and one of the things that struck me is it just sort of just brings you back and reinforces the idea that, like, for the most part, especially for the people who are involved, for the most part, this is sort of, juvenile messing around, right? And yet the way it's often treated by law enforcement certainly is that it's like, on par with terrorism. Mm-hmm. And there's this sort of very weird disconnect. And part of it, I think, is just because of, ignorance, and this is different and new, and because it's different than, graffitiing a wall or stealing beer from the corner shop, that it somehow seems scarier. But it's something that I do wonder also as the sort of more digital generation grows up and gets into positions of power, if that issue becomes less and less, or if they get less and less scared by things like that. Of course, I'm sure there'll be something new to be scared by. Yeah. But I think we're gonna wrap up this podcast, but we're gonna have you around for another podcast as well. So if for all of our listeners, if you're enjoying this conversation, keep listening to us, because Gabriella will be back.
Thanks for having me.
But thank you for being here. Thanks, everyone.
Anonymous, we late John, we don't forget. We are anonymous, we don't forget. Expect us.
He is anonymous. You are anonymous. Me. Your parents are anonymous. Your brothers and sisters and friends are anonymous.